another one of those moments where sometimes things turn a little differently when you're getting it ready and putting on the final touches, and you wake up in the morning and God kind of says, no, I want you to say this instead a little bit. So that happened a little bit today, and I hope it makes sense for all of you, because sometimes it doesn't always make sense to me, and then that gets really challenging. But sometimes people, when it makes least sense to me, is when y'all come back to me and say, that was the best one I've heard. Somehow, it works out. But we've been looking and talking about the last several weeks, how when you're looking in the book of Hebrews, how they were being persecuted. They were being kicked out of the temple. They were being, by the ruling priest, by even the high priest was taking a part in all of these things. And so the readers, these Jewish believers in Messiah, were being tempted to do, whatever they had to do in order to get back into the temple. Under that atoning ministry of the priesthood, that's set up by the Mosaic covenant. And even that temptation even included, if we have to renounce Yeshua. That was some of the conditions. Well, we'll let you back in if you renounce Yeshua, and you can come back. And so the author of Hebrews addresses this directly and tells them over and over again how you don't want to do that. There is no real need or reason to go back to that without Yeshua. And if that's a condition, then it's going to be a no. And what's amazing is we'll get into this maybe a little bit later, but that's going to be an issue and a question to be addressed even in our future, because that's coming back again. So he addresses this directly, and a big point in the argument, we looked at it starting last week, revolves around the priesthood, and really which one is better for the believer. Which one is better? And so we talked about it last week in terms of, he addresses some of the limits of the Levitical priesthood. I told you my mouth wasn't quite working. It wasn't firing on all cylinders this morning. So there are some limits to the Levitical priesthood. And for all of their importance and even their necessity, the earthly priests, the ones that are persecuting them, had limits to what they could do or what their authority was or what their ministry really was. But remember, when we're looking at this, remember the author makes all of these points about these limits without denigrating or discrediting the roles and the offices of the priesthood. Remember, we talked about that in terms of in politics today, we see all of the negative ads. And they may try to make the other one look as bad as possible and to make their candidate look better. He doesn't do that here. He speaks about what the priesthood does without denigrating them. So he didn't say they were worthless. He didn't say they were done away with or no longer filling any important role. Just that there is a greater priesthood, and that is the priesthood of Messiah. So if you weren't here last week, I just recommend going back and looking at that one, last week's video about it, explaining, expanding on these limitations. But real quick, here are some of them. There are limits of the Levitical priesthood and the high priest. They were unable to escort you into the Holy of Holies and the throne of grace. They were unable to really give you confidence and assurance before God. He says they were high priest, and the priests are subject to his own weakness and sin, for which he had to offer sacrifices first before he could even really address your situation as a regular person. He talks about this as Hebrews 7:28. For the Torah appoints as Kohanim Gedolim, the high priest, men who have weakness. He goes on and he says they were unable to perfect the worker. They were unable to make them complete or bring them to maturity. He says, now if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for based on it the people had been given the Torah, what further need was there for a different Cohen, a different priest, to arise? So there are limits to these things, and they could not bring you to that final status, that final perfection before God, or that fully restored state He talks about how they serve at a replica of the true tabernacle. They offer service in a replica and a foreshadower of the heavenlies, one that is just as Moses was instructed by God when he was about to complete the tabernacle. So the one here on earth is a replica, it's a foreshadow, but it's exactly what God instructed it to be. And it's doing exactly what God had instructed it to do. The people that were in those roles may be not doing them correctly or corrupt in some respects, but it's supposed to be doing certain things as God instructed. And so to all of these limitations that are describing the Levitical priesthood and the high priest, the author starts to contrast the priesthood of the Messiah. Because all of these limitations, all of these limits that are there for the Levitical priesthood, man, I'm having a hard time turning that, are made strengths in the Messiah. So the Messiah's priesthood is unlimited and superior. And this was trying to be a one-parter when I got started, and then I don't know if y'all could handle all of that in one day. I don't know if I could handle that all in one day. So this is at least going to be a part 1 and 2. But so the priesthood of the Messiah is unlimited and it is superior. And so the priesthood of Yeshua is a central focus of the book of Hebrews. And there are, his high priesthood is specifically mentioned 11 times in the book. And of course it's referred to and discussed in greater detail throughout the whole book. With all these different verses talking about it. And it's first mentioned, his high priesthood is first mentioned in chapter 2. So he gets to the point pretty quickly. Verse 16, he says, "For surely he is not concerned about angels, but about the seed of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in all things, so he might become a merciful and faithful Kohen Gadol, the high priest, in matters related to God, to make atonement for the sins of the people." That was the purpose of his becoming or being this high priest. It was the purpose of his being made like us. So here Yeshua is revealed to be concerned with and serving the seed or the descendant of Abraham. Those that share in his legacy of faith, whether they are by birth or whether they are by the second birth. Right? That's how we are brought in. But he makes atonement. He makes propitiation. He satisfies the judgment, the holiness, the wrath of God for our sin in a way that is even better than what the high priest in the temple is able to do. And how he does it is part of this discussion. How he does it is part of all the things these points that he is making in the book of Hebrews. See, in order to fill that role, Yeshua had to be made a human being like the rest of us. And that implies that he had a different nature before he became human. But in order to save humans, he must be a human. And so he must endure life here. Here in this broken world, here in this fallen world, and face the same temptations that we do, yet still be spotless, still be blameless, still without sin. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15. We've talked about this one. "For we do not have a Kohen Gadol who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all the same ways, yet without sin." So Yeshua's priesthood and how he fulfills it is first mentioned in chapter 2, and it's mentioned here in chapter 4. It's a major subject in chapters 4 and 5, and it's also, his high priesthood is also a major subject in chapters 7 through 10. So the high priesthood is the focal point of so many of these arguments, and it's last mentioned about Yeshua in chapter 10. Again, with an encouragement not to walk away from him and what he does on the behalf of the believer. So in chapter 10, verse 21, it says, we also have a high priest, a Kohen Gadol, over God's household. So let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and a body washed with pure water. Let us hold fast to the unwavering confession of hope, for he who promised is faithful. We have a high priest over God's household. It's because of Yeshua's role as high priest of his household, of which we read this every week in Ephesians chapter 2. Have we not been made members of God's household? Yes, we have. So we can draw near with a true heart and a full assurance of faith. And he's able to do these things. You'll notice here in 22, a true heart and full assurance of faith with hearts sprinkled clean. Who typically does the sprinkling? The priest, the high priest does. He does that. Heart sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and a body washed with pure water. What do you do when you go up to the temple? You do the mikvah. It's overseen by who?
The priest.
The priesthood, right? So he is fulfilling and doing these roles as the high priest. And so we hold fast to the unwavering confession of hope, for he who promised is faithful. And see, this idea of sprinkling our hearts clean, having a true heart, an assurance of faith, that's something that no one can do under the limits of the Levitical priesthood. And for one example that the author mentions, how all the sacrifices and all of the offerings have to be repeated day after day, year after year, and they are actually, those things are reminders that their sin has not been dealt with. They are reminders that their status has not really changed. It may be temporarily covered, but it's not permanently dealt with. So they have not been made perfect. And the daily, yearly sacrifices remind them of that. So in light of the priesthood of Yeshua, we must be unwavering without falling back into any faith that denies him. But the first question that they're going to come with in addressing all of this kind of stuff, the first question that has to be asked is, how can Yeshua be better than the Levitical priesthood? How can he be better than the high priest? How can he ever be even called a priest? Since all the priests, according to the Torah, are from the tribe of Levi. Right? All the priests are from the tribe of Levi. But Yeshua is from which tribe?
Judah.
He's from Judah. How does that work? See, those who rejected Yeshua as Messiah, they would use this as an argument. They would use this against Yeshua and try to elevate their own importance. Is that Yeshua cannot be more important than us, because we as the Levites, we as the priests and the high priest, we are over Judah. They come to us in order to be ministered and made right before God. You may have Yeshua, but you still need us, because without us, without the priesthood, without the temple, you are still going to be separated from God, and your sin is not going to be atoned for. So Yeshua can't really help you with that. That's what the argument would be. Because he's not even allowed to go into all the same places of the temple that we can. So Hebrews acknowledges this issue in that problem. Chapter 7, verse 13. He says, "For the one about whom these things are said belongs to another tribe, and from which no one has officiated at the altar. For it is clear that our Lord has sprung forth from Judah. And concerning this tribe, Moses said nothing about Kohanim. Nobody from Judah has officiated at the altar." That is very true. Again, this is an issue that would come up. Again, he says it again in chapter 8, verse 4. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a Cohen, he would not be a priest at all, since there are those who offer the gifts according to the Torah. Those who offer the gifts according to the Torah are the Levites and the priests and the high priest. So every priest that serves in the temple is doing so under the guidelines of the Torah given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Again, he's not trying to tear them down. He's not trying to diminish their significance or their importance. But in the Torah, the Levites were set aside to serve the whole people of Israel in relation to the tabernacle. Within Levi, a covenant was made with Aaron and his descendants to be the priests. And so that's where we come back, and I've said this before, that all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. But Yeshua was neither. He wasn't a descendant of Aaron. He wasn't a descendant of Levi. Yeshua, for him to be called a priest means that whatever priesthood he's serving under has to operate in a way that is different from the rules that are set up at Mount Sinai. And while that is a charge, while it's a potential problem, the author is reminding them that of even the priest's limits, and those limits prove the fact that they can't do everything that you need them to do. They can't make you perfect. They can't cleanse your conscience. They can't really get you with boldness into the presence of God before the throne of grace. All of those limits prove that you have a greater need that they cannot fulfill. They prove that there is a priesthood that is needed that doesn't have those limits and those limitations. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11. Now, if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for based on it the people had been given the Torah, what further need was there for a different priest, a different Cohen, to arise? So the Torah is expressing that a priesthood exists that is independent of the Levitical priesthood. And Yeshua is appointed in this order, and he faithfully executes his duty. This is the limit. They can't do the perfection. They can't make you whole. They can't make you complete. What further need is there for a different priest if they could do that? Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1 says, "Therefore, holy brothers and sisters, partners in a heavenly calling, take notice of Yeshua, the emissary and Kohen Gadol we affirm. He was faithful to the one who appointed him in his house." It's an interesting statement. He was faithful to the one who appointed him in his house. Who appointed Yeshua as high priest? The Father did. God did. It's his house, right? The temple is not the high priest's house. The temple is God's house. And God is appointing him. Because it sure wasn't Moses that appointed him. Moses did not appoint Messiah as high priest. It was not under the guidelines of the Mosaic covenant. The one who appointed Yeshua was the same one who appointed Moses. And that's an important point. Because Moses was appointed to the role that he had in God's house. Right? That's one of the things that that passage goes on to say. He was faithful to the one who appointed him in his house, as was Moses also. Right? So the one who appointed Yeshua was the same one who appointed Moses. But then the question is, so when was Yeshua appointed? When was Messiah appointed to this role? Now you can make the point, you can make the argument that Yeshua was appointed before the foundation of the world. I'm looking through these things, so I'm going to move this. Is that better? You could make that argument that he was appointed before the foundation of the world, but it's easy to say, you can clearly say that it occurred before the Mosaic covenant was instituted with all of those rules regarding the Levites and Aaron, because if it happened after that, then it would be bound under those rules. It had to have happened before the Mosaic covenant, because this priesthood existed, and it existed before Levi was even born. This priesthood made its appearance during the lifetime of Abraham and served as the mediator, inaugurating the Abrahamic covenant. That's an important thing to keep in mind. This priesthood of Yeshua, of the Messiah, helped inaugurate the Abrahamic covenant. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13. Now, when God made his promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, "Surely I will bless you, and surely I will multiply you." And so after waiting patiently, Abraham reached the promise. And he says a few other things in there that I could get into, but I'm kind of wanting to make a different, get to this point. Verse 19, he says that we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, both firm and steady, a hope that enters the inner place behind the curtain. Now wait a second. How does that work? Who enters in the inner place behind the curtain? The high priest. Once a year. Only the high priest is allowed to go back there. So he's talking about this. He's bringing up Abraham and the promise and all of these things in this section. But he's still talking about it in terms of, in the context of the high priesthood. So Yeshua has entered there. Who has? How could he enter there if he were not a high priest? He couldn't. But Yeshua has entered there as a forerunner on our behalf, having become the Kohen Gadol, the high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Yeshua entered behind the curtain. And so this suggests that the ministry of Melchizedek included in some way or form the Holy of Holies beyond the curtain, because that access has been granted to this order in the same way that it was granted to Aaron's order. Y'all following me on that? The Melchizedek priesthood is able to go into the Holy of Holies with the same ability or same authority, at minimum, that Aaron and the Aaronic priesthood has. And Melchizedek first appeared long before the tabernacle was ever built. Melchizedek appeared in Genesis 14, long before Sinai, long before the giving of the Torah. After this occurred, after Abraham rescued his nephew Lot and was returning everything back, he was returning from that victory, and he ran across this priest named Melchizedek. Whether that was his name or that was the title given to one of this order. In Genesis 14, verse 17, he says, "Now after he returned from defeating Kedorlaomer," I'm probably saying that wrong, I know I am, "and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh." This is the king's valley. "And then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was priest of El Elyon." He was priest of God Most High. It says in verse 19 that he blessed him. Melchizedek blessed Abram. And said, "Blessed be Abram by El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be El Elyon, who gave over your enemies into your hand." And then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Melchizedek blessed Abram. And one of the points that the book of Hebrews makes is that the lesser is blessed by the greater. The lesser is blessed by the greater. So that means who is greater than who? Melchizedek is at a higher status, a greater status than Abraham. Now that's saying something, isn't it? That's saying something. And Melchizedek, he brings out bread and wine. Now, why would he do that? Why would he bring out bread and wine? What does that remind you of?
Passover.
It's kind of like a Passover, yeah. We talked about hospitality in the Torah Club study the other night, but it's a little bit more than that. So yes, it is a meal of hospitality, but it's also one about establishing a relationship, right? He is establishing a relationship with Abraham. It's also an essential part of establishing a covenant, because every covenant has a meal that is involved or included in it. Covenants seem, and this is where I was getting off on tangent land a little bit this morning, because even Dr. Hahn here has been teaching about covenants, how there's always got to be a covenant meal in order to seal the covenant. Right? He's been teaching that here for a good while. And so then you just start looking at Genesis chapter 15. If you flip over there real quick, because I don't have it up here. Genesis chapter 15. And most of your Bibles will have a title on that section where it's the cutting of the covenant. Cutting of the covenant between Abram and God. He says, he makes those promises to him. There's that important passage about him talking about looking up into the sky and promise of descendants. And it says that Abram, he believed in Adonai and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Right? And then verse 18 of chapter 15, it says, on that day Adonai cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your seed from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River. So he is cutting a covenant with Abram. The hard part is you read through that and there's no meal. There is the sacrifices that he passes through, but that happens later. Oh, no, sorry, that's here in chapter 15. I'm looking right over it. There is the passing between the animals and the offerings, but there's no indication of them eating. And so I was trying to figure that out and think through those issues. But one thing that came to mind in all of this is that covenant doesn't just need one to close the deal. It really needs one to open the meal, or open the deal. You first have to have a meal that establishes negotiations, if you say. The first time you come in contact with somebody, you open up dialogue. And there's a dialogue that has to take place. And that opening, the first time their first meal is here in chapter 14. See, I'm going out of my own order here. Covenants seem to require one to open the relationship and another one to seal that relationship. The Abrahamic covenant was established in 15, but again, no meal is mentioned. The covenant was set up there. Circumcision was added in chapter 17, but again, no meal is mentioned. So I was struggling to try to see this. It's hard to see the pattern. The opening meal is what happens in chapter 14 with Melchizedek, where Melchizedek comes and provides the wine and the bread. That's the establishment of the negotiations, so to speak. And of course, Melchizedek, is talking about Yeshua. I believe that is a manifestation of Messiah Yeshua. The covenant is established in 15. Circumcision is added in 17. When do you think the closing meal is? The closing meal meal that seals the covenant actually occurs in chapter 18. It happens in chapter 18 when those three visitors come and Abraham stops them. It says, then Adonai, this is Genesis 18 verse 1, it says, then Adonai appeared to him at Mamre's large trees while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. When he lifted up his eyes to see, suddenly three men were standing right by him. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed down to the ground. They had already opened negotiations. My Lord, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by your servant. Please let a little water be brought so you can wash your feet, make yourselves comfortable under the tree, and let me bring a bit of bread so that you can refresh yourselves so you can pass on, since you have passed by your servant. We tend to think that these three guys are all showing up to deal with Sodom and Gomorrah. That's not their primary agenda. They came primarily to meet with Abraham. Abraham hurries out, he kills he took butter, this is verse 8, and milk, and the young ox that he had prepared, and he set it before them while he was standing by them under the tree, and they ate. Okay. They're having a meal. He is serving and being a part of that. And the first issue that they deal with is what? The promise. The promise that was made back in chapter 15 of the land and the son and the descendants. He's dealing with Sarah and the descendants. He says, about this time, in a year's time, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. So that's the close, that's the meal that seals the deal. And when you look at later in the book of Exodus, Sinai, the Mosaic covenant, went through the same pattern. It had an opening meal and a meal that sealed and closed the agreement. Now, what was the opening meal in Exodus?
Passover.
It would be Passover. Passover is that opening meal for all of these things. And the closing meal, if you want to flip over there to Exodus chapter 24, the closing meal is in Exodus 24. This is after the giving of the Ten Commandments. This is after he's been talking about the ordinances for the covenant, after the feast days, and all those different things. He says in verse 12, back up to verse 11. They saw the God of Israel under his feet. This is the elders and Moses were invited up to the mountain. It says, yet he did not raise his hand against the nobles of Bnei Israel. And so they beheld God, and they did what? They ate and they drank. Then Adonai said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the Torah and the mitzvot which I have written, that you may instruct them. Okay? Their first meal that established the relationship was the Passover meal. The meal that redeemed them occurred before the Mosaic covenant was given. Right? They were first redeemed. Then they were taken to Mount Sinai and given the Mosaic covenant to show the redeemed people how they live. Before the terms were explained, before the agreement was made, before any Levitical priesthood was set up, their opening meal, the Passover, their redemption, occurred under the terms of the Abrahamic covenant. That was what was in effect. That was the primary agreement that God was operating with. And Melchizedek was the priest that served and ministered in establishing the Abrahamic covenant. And so the Levitical priesthood does not establish the relationship, does not start, does not make the relationship with God. Because they are only established after the people have already been redeemed. So the Levitical priesthood is still necessary. They maintain that relationship with God. They make sure that people are brought back together in fellowship with God, but it does not establish that relationship with God. You need a priest in the order of Melchizedek to do that. And in fact, the Levitical priesthood pays honor to and serves under the authority of the Melchizedek priesthood, because there is a higher priesthood than the Levites. That's Hebrews chapter 7. Whoops. I backed up on that, didn't I? Hebrews chapter 7, verse 1 says, "For this Melchizedek was king of Salem," that's future called what city? In the future it's called Jerusalem. He was king of Salem, Cohen of God Most High. He met Abraham, returning from the defeat of the kings, and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a tenth of everything. First, by the translation of his name, he is king of righteousness, Melchizedek. And then also king of Salem, which means king of Shalom, or king of peace. Y'all with me so far? He says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, there's nothing that establishes him as a priest that all the other Levitical priests had to have. Right? Even when they came back from exile, they could not serve as priests unless they could prove their genealogy as a Levite and as a descendant of Aaron. They had to have their papers. They had to have their credentials in order to serve as a priest. He's got none of that. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life. In other words, there's nothing that talks about his birth, nothing that talks about his death. But made like Ben Elohim, like the Son of God, he remains a priest for all time. And now see how great this man is. For even Abraham, the patriarch, gave him a tenth out of the plunder. Remember, the greater blesses the lesser. And what do we call, what's one of the names and titles that we have for Yeshua? Right? This is his name here, King of Shalom. What's one of the titles that Yeshua has?
Prince of Peace.
Prince of Peace. It comes out of this passage. For to us a child is born, a son will be given to us, and the government will be upon his shoulder. His name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, my Father of eternity, and Prince of Peace. But it goes on, because it talks about the king, he is the prince or the king of Shalom, of peace. But first, Melchizedek means what? King of righteousness. Look how this king rules. And of the increase of his government and Shalom, and peace, there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it through what? Justice and righteousness. From now until forevermore. The zeal of Adonai Tzabaoth will accomplish this. So he is a prince of peace. And what kind of king will he be? He will be a righteous king. And Abraham paid a tenth, a tithe, to this king. And because Abraham paid a tithe to this king, that means somebody else also paid a tithe to this king. That's Levi. It says, indeed, those sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have, according to Torah, a command to collect a tithe from the people, that is, from their kin, although they have come out of the same loins of Abraham. Again, they would make the point that, Judah, of which Yeshua is from that tribe, Judah pays the tithe to us. But this one, who did not have their genealogy, has collected tithes from Abraham and has blessed him, the one holding the promises. Now it is beyond dispute that the lesser is blessed by the greater. In one case, dying men receive tithes, but in the other, about one about whom it is testified that he lives on through Abraham, even Levi, the one receiving the tithes, has paid the tithes, so to speak, for he was still in his father's loins when Melchizedek met him. So, yes, Judah pays a tithe, and they're giving it to Levi, but guess what? Levi has given a tithe already to a priest in the order of Melchizedek. So the priest of Melchizedek is greater than even the Levitical priesthood. Y'all following the logic here, the argument here? The Levites pay a tithe to Melchizedek and his priesthood. And so, therefore, Melchizedek is able, in that order of priesthood, is able to provide something that even the Levites cannot. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1 says, "Now here is the main point being said. We do have such a Kohen Gadol, such a high priest." Again, he is a high priest that has been appointed under the Abrahamic covenant. And it's under the Abrahamic covenant that our redemption was made. Our redemption takes place under the Abrahamic covenant. That's an important thing to keep in mind. We have this high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. He is a priestly attendant of the holies and of the true tent, which Adonai set up, and not man. That's not something that can be said of the Levitical priests. Goes back in chapter 4, it says this: "We do not have a Kohen Gadol who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all the same ways, yet without sins." These discussions are extremely important. This is really just part one. Again, this is establishing that the Levitical priesthood is lesser. It's not as great as the priesthood of Melchizedek. And Yeshua is a priest of Melchizedek. The Levites are priests set up by the Mosaic covenant. But the Melchizedek one came first. And so who do you really need? Whose approval do you really need? Whose ministry do you really need in the temple? Is the Levitical priesthood important? Yes. Is it the most important? No. You must have the high priest in the order of Melchizedek representing you. That's the most important thing. And so these will be discussions will become relevant again in the days when the temple is rebuilt. And at some point, it will be. There will be a functioning temple. There will be a functioning priesthood in some ways. I mean, those things have to be in place for an Antichrist to come along and be able to defile it, right? And so a lot of people will be asking the question, a lot of the Christian world will be wondering, how do we respond to that when it happens? Will they want to participate and be involved in what's happening at the temple? And then the question is, how will the Jewish authorities handle all of this interest from all of these non-Jewish people? What are they going to say about it? Will they reinstitute things like the court of the Gentiles? Will they reinstitute that you're not allowed to participate, you're not allowed to come in and participate in these things unless you go through a strict and formal conversion process? And then more importantly, what will they do with all those Jewish people who believe in Yeshua, who want to participate in the temple? Much like the believers in Yeshua in the book of Hebrews, who were getting kicked out of the temple. Will this temple authority let them in? Or will they require denying Yeshua? Will that be a precondition for them to participate? See, all of this stuff is going to come back in some way or some form. And the book of Hebrews is trying to prepare his people to answer, and what do we do? Because the bottom line of it is, the answer that Hebrews provides will be more important and relevant in those days. Because if participation in the temple requires renouncing Yeshua, the answer is you are better off remaining outside of the temple and not participating in it at all if the requirement is to reject Yeshua. Y'all with me? Why? Because he is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And we're going to get into more of this next week because it goes into more detail of why he is greater and why his service is more important. That you can be right with God and not be right with the temple. You can be right with God and not be in good graces and have the opinion of the high priest on your side. Because you have another high priest who will speak before you. And he is the high priest who is appointed under the terms of our redemption, that is the Abrahamic covenant. He was appointed in that role before Levi and the Aaronic priesthood was ever established, before they were even born. Does that make sense? I hope so. Because that stuff about the covenant meal and having one that inaugurates it and one that closes it is important, because that really also says something to us. Because when was our meal established our relationship with God? Isn't it communion, which is out of Passover, where the Lamb of God, the sacrificed lamb, was slain? That was the meal that gave us that access. The offering of the Kohen Gadol, which we'll get into, the high priest in the order of Melchizedek, that established our relationship with him. And then we, since then, have been learning how to live as God's people. And so when is our closing meal that seals the deal? What's that? It's Sukkot,
the marriage supper,
with the wedding feast of the Lamb. That's the one that seals it. So this pattern of the opening meal and the closing meal, it still matters to us. Y'all with me?
yes, sir.
And that's what we are looking forward to. So in these days ahead, when we're trying to, these things come back, and we're trying to answer all these questions and figure all these things out, it's already been talked about. And the pattern has already been set. And so we just need to trust and hold firm to our Kohen Gadol, who speaks and serves on our behalf.